Hey there, I'm Jackie Ferris. This week on the 302, we are at Rockwood Park and Mansion doing their version of upstairs, downstairs, and taking a look at all of the people who spent their lives in service here. Get ready for the white glove treatment. The 302 is headed your way. We're at Rockwood Mansion to talk a little bit about a new exhibit called Below the Stairs and in the Attic. I'm joined now by Ryan Grover. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for coming back.
Well, typically when we come to visit you, we hear a lot about the Shipleys and the Bringhursts, but this is an exhibit that introduces us to people who were very active, played a very active role in the history of the house, but maybe we don't know too much about.
For certain, the house really, a house of this scale with the estates around it really depended on a huge number of individuals to keep it running on a day-to-day basis. It was the armies of people that had to keep the owners of this house occupied. It was pretty astounding. So we felt like we really needed to start telling that story.
Because it's a story that has gone untold for so long, and it's such a rich history.
Most certainly, most certainly. There have been probably, I don't know, easily over 65, 70 different servants that have worked here in the 120 years that the family had occupied the house. So a significant number of individuals that far outweigh the number of people who actually owned this estate.
And I guess you have a lot of artifacts for the family, but thankfully, because of one of the family members, you have a lot of artifacts for the people who live here, which is really unusual.
One of the things that we're really trying to use to sort of feature this new storyline is this fantastic, this really treasure of photographs that we have associated with the house. The earliest photographs, and there's probably over 7,000 of them available. And the earliest photos date to the 1860s, really within the first couple of years that the house was built, because this house was completed in 1854 in its first stage. And the last of those photos go up well into like the 1960s. So you're looking at this like 100-year period of time. And in those photographs, not only are like the changing face of the interiors or new changes that they did to the exterior of the house, but also the people that worked here. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of photographs representing those individuals who worked here over a long period of time, and we've been able to identify a lot of those people. It's a really rich, it's become a really rich story for us.
So let's talk a little bit about where we are now in the mansion. This is the scullery. So
when the house was first created, the room that we're standing in right now was called the scullery. And it's basically just sort of a washroom. It was a place where you would be able to, it would have specialized equipment to heat water so that you would be able to wash dishes, wash clothing, and keep all of our surfaces really clean throughout the entire house. And it's separate. At this time frame, these services within the house were separate from the cooking side. So just on the back wall next to us here is the kitchen.
And we're going to go visit that space in just a moment. But I guess the whole point, too, in putting this exhibit together to highlight the folks, like the people we see in the photos behind us, also just to denote the separation between the main house and the people that kept it running, right?
For certain, yeah. One of the greatest assets about being able to tell this story about the servants that worked here at Rockwood has to do with the actual architecture itself. So the main house, the house that was occupied by those individuals who lived here, that owned the house, is elevated. So those spaces are at street level. They are able to be easily occupied, easily getting in and out of. But the servant spaces are always lowered and separate from that main block of the house. And so the space that we're here is almost 6 feet lower than the first floor of the main house, has a completely separate entrance within the building entirely. The room dimensions are a lot smaller. The way that the space would have been lit originally would have been much different than you find in the rest of the house. It's much more task-oriented here, where in the rest of the house, it's meant to really sort of demonstrate luxury and conspicuous consumption.
So let's talk about the people we're seeing in the photos here.
For certain.
Who do we have here?
So everyone that you're seeing here are all from the Bringhurst period. So after about 1892, descendants of the builder of this house, Joseph Shipley, the Bringhurst, his niece's family, they took over this house. She bought it at auction in 1892, and she gave it to her son and his children grew up here. They lived here for almost 100 years. And a lot of the individuals that you see here, like Lottie Robinson, was a cook just around the turn of the century. Mr. McCormick, terrible photograph, but there are other really great examples. He was a butler that was actually brought here from England and paid an exorbitant amount because it was really prestigious to have a British butler in the first part of the 20th, well, even in the 1800s as well.
Now, when you say an exorbitant amount, it was $25 an hour, which is what a lot of folks consider a really good salary these days.
There were a number of individuals who worked here, both for the Shipleys as well as the Bringhursts, who retired very wealthy people.
Well, that's good to hear.
It's strange. It's really the stories that come unfolding from this space is really, really amazing.
So there were like relationships that were formed.
Absolutely. There were a couple of servants that were here for over 40 years.
Wow.
And individuals that, like, for instance, the what was her name? Audrey. She was the first housekeeper of Rockwood. She came with Joseph Shipley from England. He hired her in England. She came with an infant daughter. She lived here with him for about 15, 20 years until he died, stayed here and lived with his sisters, Joseph Shipley's unmarried sisters. Upon the death of Joseph Shipley, he left her $10,000, which she invested in local real estate. She died a very wealthy woman in the first part of the 20th century, and the infant daughter that grew up here married the mayor of Wilmington. So they did pretty well.
Absolutely. Well, tell us about George Taylor and Guido.
Oh, so George Taylor, up in the upper left-hand corner, he was, I believe that he started as a farmhand. Rockwood is originally surrounded by almost 400 acres of agricultural space. So I believe that he started as a farmhand, but then he started to have more and more responsibilities within the house as well. He was also one of the individuals that worked for Edward Bringhurst Jr., the third actually, in his dog raising, dog training activities. So he was raising dogs to be able to show them at local competitions. Guido is the Great Dane that you see here, and one of Mr. Taylor's prime responsibilities.
Wow.
Sort of a prize Great Dane.
So much history, and we're going to learn more, and we're going to head over into the kitchen when we come back.
I'm Justin Day from Jessup's Tavern, and I love the vittles on the 302.
Welcome back. We're at Rockwood talking about below the stairs and in the attic. We're joined by Ryan Grover. Now, Ryan, I know that in putting together this exhibit, you discovered a lot of disparities and yet a lot of, I guess, a lack of disparities with the people that kept this house going. Tell us about that.
One of the great stories that continues to sort of unfold with the servants tour and the additional research that we're doing is looking at race and the representation of underrepresented people here within the museum. And so for a long time, people would come and they wouldn't see their own face in the people that we were talking about. The owners were all Caucasian. They were all very wealthy. And so to talk about the servants is to talk about individuals that really come from more your and my background, but also represented people of color. And so this was a really fun, exciting opportunity for us to be able to tell those stories. And at first we were worried, so it was the 1800s. This was, there was huge racial disparities. I mean, it was such a difficult part. This house was built at the time when slavery was still legal here within the state. And so we had no idea what we would necessarily find. Thankfully, we did not find a connection to enslaved people here on the estate, although we would have told that story as well. But what we did find is that individuals came here and even though there were difficulties between the ways that white servants were treated versus the way that black servants were treated within the house, in some cases there were rules that happened that were completely counter to that. So there's every indication that that black and white servants were separate, like during meal times, sort of strange customs like that. But in other cases, like we know that black servants were living under the same roof as white servants here within the main house, and that these relationships relationships lasted for 10 and 15 years. So, so sometimes you think that you've got it right, but then other new information comes in and you're just like, we have to retell this story entirely. So it's really, really interesting.
So when you talk about the disparities, I know that, you know, some of the white staff members were paid a little bit more than the black staff members. But did you see any instances where we talked about relationships in the last segment where, you know, some of the black staff members formed that bond and were kind of elevated because of the relationship they were able to?
So like Robert McCormick, that butler that I was talking about from the 20th century, he's a perfect example of this. So he was a British butler that came here to work specifically at Rockwood. And this was a very desirous kind of, you wanted the first face at your front door to be a British butler. It was just a great status symbol. But the builder of this house, Joseph Shipley, his first butler was African American, and he lived with him for 15 years. And his butler was paid at the rate that a British butler would have been paid during his lifetime, and he was mentioned in his will. So it's interesting to me that you think that you've got these sort of, you know how people are going to act in certain circumstances, but then they sort of shift up on you and they sort of act in a completely unpredictable way.
So I guess it's a good surprise whenever you're going through to see that there was some equity and some strong relationships there.
I will say the majority of individuals of color that worked here did work for less than their white counterparts. However, those relationships, we have, for instance, here within the kitchen, we have cooks that worked here, African American cooks. Almost all of the cooks that were here were African American throughout the entire history of Rockwood, and most of them were being paid at fair or better than fair living wages. We have one particular cook in the later 20th century that was so desired that the people that lived here so desired her to be here that they paid for her cab fare every day to come to and from Wilmington.
That's cool.
Because she had a family in Wilmington and she would have to come out here.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what you have here in the kitchen to kind of, you know, be an example of what they had to work with. Now, this table is really special, right?
Oh, fantastic. So the table is probably from the 1890s, and it is original to Rockwood. It's probably been traveling around in the various locations where kitchens have occurred. This is like the fourth kitchen that, or excuse me, we've probably had about 4 different kitchens at Rockwood. Over the years, they keep moving these service spaces to incorporate more and more servants. And so, but this kitchen table is probably moved in each of those permutations. And now we have it here as sort of as a centerpiece within our kitchen display. Just
think about all the meals and all the cakes and all the pies and everything that happened on this table.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. It makes you hungry. So I wanted to ask you about the annunciator over here.
Absolutely.
When you walk in, you don't really know what it is. It kind of looks like a clock because there are hands, it looks like. What exactly is that?
So it's called an annunciator. It would be sort of a bell call system that servants would be able to see. So wherever an individual owner of the house was located anywhere within their house, they would be able to ring a bell or like ring, they would be able to pull a string or perhaps hit a button either in the wall or in the floor. And it would tell not only where they were, what kind of help that they needed, but it would be also an indication of which of the servants should come. Because so, for instance, like the butler, their job was to take care of the area on the first floor, like the entrance, the dining room, the withdrawing room, the morning room. But the housekeeper and her staff would have been upstairs in the bedrooms, the bathroom areas. And so, depending upon where the need was and who was calling, a different servant would come running.
Absolutely. Now tell us a little bit about this contraption here. You tell me that is a knife sharpener, and I just don't see it. How does it work?
This is actually one of 3 knife sharpeners that we have here in the estate, and I don't really know why we ended up with so many of them. But you'd be able to insert your knife and then roll the grinding stones, and you'd be able to sharpen the blades. Unfortunately, these the examples that we have today are broken. The Shipley and Bringhurst families that lived here got rid of nothing. And so when they started to clear out the carriage house, which is now sort of our event space for weddings and things across the way. They started clearing that out later in the 20th century. They found all of these fantastic devices. They found the original sink, the copper sink that we were in the scullery. They found that literally sitting on top of a carriage because it had fallen through the floors. I mean, really funny stories like that.
Okay, so we've been below the stairs, and when we come back, we're going to go up toward the attic. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Nataki Oliver, gallerist of the Soul Firm Art Gallery. Here in the 302, we believe artists deserve red roses and red dots.
Welcome back. We are now upstairs talking about below the stairs and in the attic. I'm joined by Ryan Grover. So let's talk a little bit about, where we are now. This is an amazing room. All of this lace. Now, this was worn by all of the ladies of the house.
Right. So, like I said, they never got rid of anything. And what we were able to do is to turn what is called the sewing room into kind of an open storage facility. So all of these lace trims, all of these little additions, all of these delicate little pieces they would have sewn onto a collar or a cuff or a hat, we've been able to bring them all together, and we make these sort of temporary displays, basically, of a lot of these objects here. And at the same time, you're also talking about another sort of very special space for specialized servants with skills here within Rockwood, another way that they're sort of contributing to one of the great assets of the house.
Absolutely. We talked about the cooks preparing the meals, the butlers taking care of, various things, the way that their the madam or the mister of the house looked. And this person who would be sitting here would take care of various sewing duties.
Absolutely. And interestingly, this is one of the few places in the house where more than likely the owners of the house also probably would have participated in the activities of the space along with the servants. Usually there's a dramatic sort of separation between the two, very little overlap with the two. But in here, because sewing and hand skills and especially delicate sort of decorative work was such a highly prized kind of quality for women, especially women of a certain kind of certain class, certain level of education, it was so highly prized that they were able to do it that they would have probably helped to contribute to some of their own sort of decorative pieces, not only for the house, but the things that they would have worn.
Now, when we're talking about all of these servants that would have been in the house, there are 50 rooms, and 12 of them were designated for servants. Now, that's something that you couldn't, as a servant, you couldn't just expect. That was unusual, right?
It was, especially in the way that this house sort of grew into those weird numbers. So it started, the house started off in 1851, a much smaller place, and then, but in successive waves of expansion and remodeling, we see more and more rooms being added on. In almost every case, it's just to accommodate more bedrooms for servants. And while that was happening, the kitchen moved locations, the scullery moved locations, the wash house. They added specialty spaces like the sewing room. But really, it was to create it was because between the Shipleys and the Brinkhurst, the Shipley, he had like 6 house servants. The Brinkhurst at their height had like over a dozen, like I think it was over 18 servants just for the house itself, not even counting those individuals that were taking care of the garden and the farm spaces outside. So you needed places to be able to rest them, for them to live, to be able to sleep in. Some servants did live in Wilmington, especially if they had families, but a lot of servants lived here and lived here for a really long time.
I can imagine. Now, there were children that lived in the house. Were nannies included in some of the... Can you tell us about them?
I don't recall her name offhand, but there were a couple of nannies, especially for Edward III. So this would have been the youngest child and only son of the member of the Brinkhurst family that moved in the 1890s.
Now, is he the one that's responsible for a lot of the photographs that you have in your collection?
Photography was one of his great interests. He never married, but he really dedicated himself to arts, to literature. He was training dogs, like I said earlier, and showing dogs. He was really interested in horticulture. He was an antique collector of American antiques before anybody was an antique collector. But he had a lot of specialized staff here specifically just for him.
I'm really amazed by all of the research that goes in when you put together an exhibit like this. You have a lot of artifacts, but where do you go for the rest to fill in the blanks and some of the stories that you tell? Because don't they unfold a lot of the times? You say, oh, would be a good subject for us.
For sure. Remarkably, the Brinkhurst especially, but also the Shipleys, they kept papers. And there were some really, really forward-thinking members of the family later in the 20th century that were really interested in bringing all of these old papers, especially financial records, check stubs, bank records, and then even sort of lists and inventories of the objects here in the house, old architectural records, and even logbooks for the house about who was being paid and at what time. gleaning from all of this sort of surfing over all of these different sort of source materials, we're able to figure out who was in the house at a particular time and what kind of, what sort of role they may have played in operating or living in the space.
Now, we only got to see 3 rooms in our tour, but there's much more that people can see. So.
Oh, for sure. The servants tour that we've created, it has, there are portions of it that act like an exhibition. So they have, we have displays of objects that they might have made or things that they might have contributed, ways that they sort of made changes to the house and to the sort of to the operations of the house. But a lot of it is just sort of touring the house and seeing these architectural spaces that they dwelled in and talking about how that sort of evolved and grew over town. That tour lasts over 90 minutes, and we offer it at least once a month.
So if I want to take this tour, let's say I want to grab my husband and come back and check it out, how do I find out when the tour is happening, how much it costs, etc.?
Rockwood.org. Yeah, the website is the best piece of information. On the very first page, you'll start to see links to all of our educational programs, all of the different kinds of tours that we offer. Because the Servants Tour is just one of several specialty tours that we run seasonally. So it's so there's lots of information there with current pricing and exactly when it's going to happen. But I should say, one of the things that we've been sort of initiating recently is that if you don't see a time frame that works for you, but you have a group that wants to do it, just give us a call. We'll figure something out. We can always arrange for a sort of specialty time frame for you.
Fantastic. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to come and visit you here.
Thank you for coming back.
We'll be right back. For more information on Rockwood and all of its exhibits and tours, visit rockwood.org. That'll do it for this week's episode of The 302. We're going to leave you now with some beauty shots outside on the grounds. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. Tell them you saw it on The 302.